Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Stacy Costell, and I am the CEO for the Coalition for College, and I would like to welcome you to the third of our application sections, our series, I should say, and this one will be on letters of recommendation. If this is your first time being at one of our application series, let me tell you a little bit about the Coalition. The Coalition is a membership organization made up of about 150 different schools and organizations from around the country that are all committed to access, affordability, and student success. And really what that means to you is our members are committed to smart financial aid packages, graduating you on time, and making sure that they are accessible institutions for students from all different types of backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses. One of the things I like to point out about Coalition schools is how successful Coalition members are in really retaining and graduating their students. So if you look at the average number of students who stay in higher education after 1 year or graduate, you'll see that members of the Coalition are 17% higher in their retention rate and 20% higher than their graduation rate. So again, when you're thinking about how long and how much you want to spend in education, starting with those smart choices of Coalition schools is a great place to begin your college search. Now, I think all of you know about mycoalition.org, which is a way that you can apply to college, but there's lots of other ways that you can use our tools as well. So you can go on right now and start your account. I know many of you are going to be seniors next year, but for those of you who might be younger, you can do this as early as your freshman year in high school. And this is a great way to start getting information about where you are in the process, as well as getting invited to events. Now, if you'd like some information that's not always in your inbox, then I'd really encourage you to follow us on Instagram, where we have some great content that is actually provided by our member admissions counselors and financial aid officers to get you started on that college search and tell you a lot about the institutions that are members. So today we have a great panel prepared for you that is going to tell you their advice on preparing your letters of recommendation. And so I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves. And as they do, they're also going to share with you a teacher or mentor that they would have had write them a letter of recommendation when they were applying to college, or in fact, maybe they did. So we'll start with you, Jason.
Thanks, Stacy. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you joining us today. My name is Jason Andracki, and I'm at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. The teacher that I wanted to mention actually did write my recommendation letter. It was Mr. Petro, who was the newspaper advisor for my high school. And I had him in a number of classes, journalism, a few years, and a lyrics and verse class.
Great. Deanna?
Thanks, Stacy, and thank you for including me on this panel. So happy to be here. I'm Deanna Dixon. I am Dean of Admission at Smith College. We're in Western Massachusetts. And the person that I was very happy to have write a recommendation for me when I was applying to college was my English teacher. Her name was Mrs. Bunton. And I asked her for a recommendation because English was one of my strong subjects and I did well in her classes, and she got to know me a little bit, and she was also advisor for a club that I belonged to, the Black Student Union. So, so that was my teacher.
Thank you. Thomas?
Thank you, Stacy. Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Ray. I'm an assistant dean in the Office of Admission at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. As I think back to my admission process, I hope that I asked a dear teacher, a dear mentor of mine, Major Steve Jones to write a recommendation for me. I was involved in ROTC all 4 years of high school, and so naturally spent a lot of time with him inside and outside of school itself. And so he was someone that I built a really close relationship with, and someone that I would have really wanted to share my strengths and share a bit about me with the institutions of which I was applying. Yes, Major Jones definitely for me was someone that I definitely wanted to advocate for me.
Thank you, Thomas. How about you, Lisa?
Hi, Stacy. Thanks for the invite for being with you all today. I'm Lisa Maselli, and I've been helping students and families in both higher ed and high school for almost 30 years. And I've been the director of college counseling at the University of Illinois Laboratory High School since 1993. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. And for my reflection on letters of rec, I did not get a chance to ask this gentleman, and I wish I would have. I wish I would have asked my yearbook advisor, because I was the editor of the yearbook. And I think my activities that took place after school and sometimes went deep into the weekend hours as we were trying to create our final edition of the yearbook evidenced so many of those 21st century skills like collaboration and teamwork and resiliency. And I think that the voice from my yearbook advisor would have been something good to round out my voice and the skills that I would bring to a college campus.
Thank you. And Caden.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me with you here today. My name is Caden Thompson. I am the Director of College Admissions with Philadelphia Futures. We are a CBO in the Philadelphia area that works with first-generation students. I myself, while I'm not a first-gen student, both of my parents were, and so first-generation experiences are very near and dear to me. I come from a background of having worked in admissions for a couple of different universities, specifically focusing on working with first-gen students and low-income students. One of the teachers that I asked to write my letter of recommendation when I was in high school was one of my history teachers, Wendy Gifford. And she was my history teacher for all 4 years throughout high school. And while she did not supervise me or coach me in any other activities, she was a teacher that was very important and formative to me throughout my high school time. And I spent many, many hours in her classroom over break times and lunchtime, getting advice on my future and starting to think about what my life after college would look like.
Thank you. That's great. So you can see we have a great group of presenters that are going to give you some great advice on letters of recommendation. Before they get started, I quickly want to talk about the process for requesting a letter of recommendation inside My Coalition. And then I will turn it over to do a quick Q&A with our panelists today. So students, as a reminder, if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So I want to start quickly with something that we call the college list. So when you go in and make your My Coalition account, one of the first things that you should do is do your college list. When you go to the college list, it lists every single school that you can apply to. And for coalition schools, which you can see with the My Coalition emblem there, that is a great way to get on their mailing list. So if you're not already getting information from them, you can quickly add them to your college list and say include me on your mailing list. The other great thing about the college list is when you go to the profile section, which really becomes your application, it will show which of the schools you're applying to require letters of recommendation and from whom. So of the 150 members of the coalition, about 90 require letters of recommendation. Some of them don't. For the 90 that do, some of them want it to be from a counselor, some want to be from a teacher, some want it from both, some want it from other recommenders. So it's a great way to find out what you need to do, and you can do that right away. So as we always say, start early, stress less, getting on, building your account and seeing which letters of recommendation you need to start thinking about as early as today. So when you do, when you're ready to make that request, you go into your account, which is the same place the college list is, but this time you're going to go to the section called My Locker, and you're going to hit the drop down called Official Documents. And right here, you will see the section that says request official documents and recommendations. And you can see that you'll see your high school counselor, you'll see a teacher, or you'll see other requester. So here they are. So if you want to do a high school counselor request, whichever one you want to hit, you simply check on that. And then you can go ahead and include their email if they're not already on your student supporter list. And they will send, and an email request will go to that person. Now, one thing that I want to make sure that you're aware of is when you come to this section and it says request counselor recommendation, a box pops up that says, do you want to view this document? And you can either waive your rights or do not waive your rights. And I know this gets confusing, but really if you, basically this is giving you rights to view your letter of recommendation once you've enrolled in the college. So it doesn't mean you get to review the recommendation before it's sent. So anyway, we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you have questions, but really this is about reviewing that information after you enroll, not prior to applying. And then after you send your recommendation email, it will show that it is in progress once that person has opened up and agreed to do that for you. So it's really that simple. You get on My Coalition, you go to the locker, you send emails to people that you want to do letters of recommendation, and you can follow and track the status of that information. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Derek, who is a member of the Coalition team, and he is going to do a quick panel and Q&A with our panelists today.
Hey everyone, thank you, Stacy. My name is Derek Chell, and I'm the Director of Member Engagement here with the Coalition, and I have the pleasure of moderating this Q&A. So before we get started, once again, I do want to remind all of you all that the Q&A function is enabled. So please type in your questions there, and we'll aim to answer as many as we can in the time that we have left today. A few of you did submit some questions in advance, so I'll go ahead and cover those first. So the first question I'm actually going to throw out to Thomas. So one student said that they planned on getting letters of recommendations for their college application from the people that they worked with through an internship. So will colleges consider these and will they benefit them in the admissions process?
It's a great question. And I think I want to preface my answer first and foremost by saying, follow the instructions. As Stacy has mentioned, there are some institutions that are pretty clear and pretty direct with the kinds of recommendations that they want to receive from you. But if you do have that flexibility, if you have someone that you've worked with, a boss, whether it was an actual job, whether it was an internship, sure, take advantage of the opportunity to ask them to write on your behalf. Because essentially the kinds of skills that you develop in the workplace, kinds of experiences that you'll have are a little bit different when you're working than when you're in high school. And so recommendations are all about bringing you to life and providing these new examples of opportunities that you've experienced, things that you've overcome, skills that you've developed. And so sure, take advantage of the internship piece of your experiences, or the job piece of your experiences. Feel free to ask those supervisors or those bosses to write for you, because yes, it will be advantageous, and yes, it will certainly help move you one step closer to admission to those schools that you find.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thomas. The next question that I have, I'm going to ask Jason actually. So one student asked, they are an online student. They were an online student for the majority of the year. And it turns out that they feel like their teachers don't necessarily know them well enough to write about them in a recommendation letter. So they just wanted to know if you had any advice on how to approach this situation.
I do, and I'm going to follow Thomas's lead and have a little bit of an intro before I get to that exact question, and just say this has been a rough year and a half for all of us. I don't think anyone here on this screen has gotten into working with high school students in order to be on Zoom all day. Sure, more time at home with our pets and maybe children and things, doing laundry during the workday. There may be some positives, but this has not been ideal for any of us. I know, you know, I'm speaking for Allegheny, but I think speaking for a whole lot of coalition schools, a whole lot of schools in general, that we're going to be flexible, you know, with recommendations, with things like other parts of your application where, you know, we're asking about involvement that you have, which certainly extracurricular involvement is going to look completely different than it has. Maybe even grading scales are different. So in general, we're going to be flexible. In terms of some like concrete answers to your question, talk to your teacher, you know, whether it's sending an email, instant message, a text, or, you know, if you're able to talk in person. But it's been difficult for teachers as well. You know, they don't know you as well as they would like. You know, those, you know, handful of minutes before a class started where maybe you're just talking about you know, what you watched on TV the night before, or, you know, sports or other school activities. That's stuff that goes into those letters of recommendation, and they're missing out on that. So I think one thing would be is communicate with your teachers. Ask them, oh, I would like you to write a letter of recommendation for me for my college application, but is there information that I can provide that will help you with that? You know, maybe partner with them in that, you know, because yes, they're doing the work of writing the recommendation, and you can't put words in their mouth necessarily, but see if there's something that, you know, you can provide them to help. But most importantly, just, you know, be open. Also, yes, colleges like to know, you know, more recently what's been going on. So your junior year is maybe an ideal time to think of, you know, teachers, but you know, we want to hear from a sophomore year teacher, you know, a 9th grade teacher as well, you know, if that's going to help. So again, you know, we're all dealing with differences from this past year. So we want to do what's best for you. So there's going to be a lot of flexibility in how we view things like recommendations.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. So this next question I think is really great. And I'd love to hear it from the admission side as well from the counseling side. So I'm going to throw this over to Deanna. So can a coach or an academic tutor write a student's letter of recommendation?
That is a great question. And I feel like before we get to the actual answers of the questions, we each have had some way to kind of preface what we're going to say. I too am going to do that. And I'm going to offer a way to look at why we are interested in these recommendations and what we are doing with them on the admission side. How, you know, what use are these recommendations in the application process? And there are two things I want to offer that might help answer this question. And that is that one is that, you know, college being an academic, you know, academic places, one of the things we're doing is we are putting together people in a classroom, and we're an academic environment. So we want to understand what kind of student you are. The other thing that many of us are doing is that we are putting people together to create a community. So some of us are from residential colleges where students actually live on campus. Other campuses might not be 100% residential, but you might, you know, come into the college or commute to college. But even if you're not living on campus, there are other ways to enjoy the campus environment. So you're part of a club or an organization, and you're still part of a community. It just might not be a residential community. So how that relates to recommendations is that one of the things that's very important to us is the information that we would get from your teachers. So in that case, a coach or a tutor might not be able to answer directly the question of what kind of student are you in the classroom? So what kind of contributor might you be when you are engaged in a discussion? Are you a person who raises your hand often? Are you, you know, does the class miss you when you're absent from the classroom? Some of that kind of information. On the other hand, in getting to know you as a person, there is a lot to be said from a recommendation from a coach. or even an academic tutor who understands how hard you're working and you know, the effort that you're putting into succeeding, how you handle challenges, how resilient you are. So there are pieces of you that we could get through a lot of different types of recommendations. It would be important to understand, because we're all different, what types of recommendations we might you know, prefer when we're getting an idea of who you are. So I guess that's my long-winded way of answering, is it good to ask a coach or an academic tutor? I would recommend in many cases that if you have one of those types of recommenders, that maybe they supplement your recommendations that do come from classroom teachers. So you have classroom teachers, and then you add, you know, one or two other recommendations from a coach or a tutor, as long as that is acceptable from the school that you're applying to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deanna. I just wanted to throw this over to either Kaden or Lisa, see if you all had anything to add to that.
Yes, I would definitely be echoing what Deanna said. A supplemental letter, just like I shared that I wish I would have asked my yearbook advisor, is a great way to complement the voices, but you have to focus first on the academic recommendations regarding what you bring to the classroom. And those 21st century skills and essential growth skills can come through those letters, but start with your academic choices first, and then think what voices might be missing if you want to round it out, if the college accepts those supplements.
I totally agree. I think it's really important to be mindful of the requirements of each college or university that you're applying to, and ensure that you're not providing them with material that they're not going to use or not going to read as part of their admissions process. But yes, if you're part of an organization, particularly like a community-based organization similar to Philadelphia Futures, having that third type of letter, a supplemental letter, can be really helpful for you. It could be possible that that community counselor might know aspects of your academic journey or your college access journey that folks in your high school may not be as familiar with. And so that could add a really important layer to your story that is very important for admissions officers to know and consider. So that's one thing that I always recommend students keep in the back of your mind as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the next question that was asked was, should a student give a brag sheet to their recommender? And I'm going to toss that over to Lisa.
This is a great question, and I love when students ask this. I do like to reframe that and not necessarily call it a brag sheet, but call it a self-reflection for your faculty or your author of who's going to write for you, because I do think that term bragging kind of comes off as very, you know, self-fulfilling, and you kind of feel like it's tapping yourself on the back. And I do think a lot of students really struggle with this admissions process because they feel like they're bragging and it feels yucky to them. So I think because modesty kind of comes through and we try to help them bring out their best selves in this journey, if you can think about the privilege that a teacher has when they write for you. Yes, it takes a ton of time, but when you ask a faculty member or an advisor or someone to write for you, you're coming to them and saying, I believe we have a relationship and you have stories that are worth telling. And that is a privilege for us to be a part of that journey with you. But I do want students to think about their partnership with the teacher or anyone else who's writing as, how can I support them in their role of doing this task for me? Because I can tell you, as someone who's written letters of rec for over 25 years, they take time. And the proof in the letters that the admissions officers are looking for are those anecdotal examples, those details that bring something to life so that they're not just empty adjectives that are thrown out there. So I do encourage students to always think about, how am I evidencing curiosity in class? Do I want to remind a teacher about a proud moment, even if it means that you're going to give them a copy of your paper back because the comments in their margins were so important to you that you want to remind them of that moment? Or maybe you almost dropped the class and you decided to stay with that class, right? Reflect for that teacher on what was the resiliency that came through for you to face those obstacles. So I think if you can think about your forward thinking skills, how you care for others in the classroom. I loved how Deanna said, how does the class feel when you're absent, right? What kind of energy do you bring to the conversation? And even when Jason said, right, what can you bring to the teacher to remind them of some of these moments that you feel like you had exhibited all of those curiosity, collaboration, creativity, communication skills. Sometimes your job as a student is to not feel like you are giving them words to write their letter, right? Everyone said that's not your job. But I do think your job is to look at this as, okay, if I'm going to ask someone to write for me, maybe again, even though they know me and I'm not afraid the teacher has forgotten me, but the details can sometimes fall between the cracks, especially if you haven't talked with the teacher on a regular basis. So feel free to put together some type of narrative for them that gives you the agency to even share with them things they may not know. If there's one example I want the students to keep in mind, I always think about the letter of recommendation as an iceberg. Above the waterline, you see the iceberg. The question is, what's below the waterline, right? Sometimes you have to be that student who basically reminds teachers, advisors, CBO counselors, whoever's writing for you. You may know me here, but if I'm really allowing myself to be vulnerable with you, there's probably more to my story and my journey that you don't know. And if you're willing to be vulnerable and go below that waterline, your letters of recommendation are going to be so much more meaningful. So that's my hope for students. And I also want to let students know, don't let this concept of putting things together for your teachers or your recommendation writers to be a barrier. For some of you, putting it in writing could be a challenge. Just ask your teacher if you can meet with them. Can you talk things through narratively? Let them take notes as you talk. So even though we give you tips, sometimes as counselors, we call it homework, just to kind of put some ownership on you with some accountability to do a task that we think is going to help you in the end. We know sometimes those tasks that we advise you to do can be a barrier. Don't let that stop you. Just reach out to your teachers and ask them, how can I be of service to you to help you do this important role for me?
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. So the next question that was submitted, and I actually see that it's been submitted in the Q&A quite a few times. So students are wondering, is it better to have a core subject teacher such as math, science, English, social studies, write your letter of recommendation, or a teacher that is from an elective course like art or music? So I'm going to throw that over to Kaden.
Thanks so much, Derek. So I have a general answer, but I'm also going to add an asterisk, it depends at the end of it. So typically a core teacher definitely is what colleges admissions counselors are hoping to see from a letter of recommendation. As Deanna already noted, they're looking to have an understanding of how you show up in the classroom, how you're going to participate in a college setting. Again, this is focusing on an educational experience for you, right? And so you are going to college to create a major, to enroll in a major, to have some type of intensive educational academic experience. So admissions counselors are trying to assess what your fit is for those types of programs, and likely a core teacher is going to be able to reflect most strongly on your capacity to excel in these styles of courses. However, depending on what type of student you are, an elective teacher might be able to provide a really important aspect or perspective on you as a student and you as a learner. The colleges that you're applying to may ask for more than one letter of recommendation. So that may be a situation where you can make a smart choice to ask one core subject teacher and one elective subject teacher. Again, if you're feeling that that elective and your performance in that class, your engagement with that teacher is really strongly representative of you as a student and the work that you're capable of performing in the college setting. I would also add, if you are someone who is interested in majoring in a course that has only been offered as an elective at your high school, we may initially be thinking of things like visual and performing arts, or if you are at a school that has an elective like robotics or computer science, and that is a subject that you are intending to major on once you're in the college space, having a letter of recommendation from that teacher may be a strong representation of you as a student, and again, highlight aspects of you as a learner that don't show up elsewhere in your application.
Thank you, Kaden. So I actually want to toss this over to some of our admissions folks as well. So I'll actually ask Thomas So would you like for students to submit a recommendation from a major or from a subject that they intend to major in, or does it matter? Can it be an unrelated major and subject?
It's a great question, and if I'm honest, I don't really know how to follow up with what Caden has said up to this point, because he's just, man, yeah, he's really answered it well. The "it depends," that clause, I think it just keeps coming to mind, you know, for institutions that evaluate applications, and I apologize, I'm bending your question a little bit, Derek. For institutions that are evaluating applications holistically, there may be other spaces and other opportunities to demonstrate your strength and ability to do well in the area that you might major in. And so it may be an opportunity for you to show a different side of you. It may be an opportunity for you to put on display the other skills that you might have outside of that subject area by asking someone to write and to advocate for you who is not involved in the area that you're interested in. Again, that kind of evaluation, that kind of approach is probably more typical of liberal arts institutions. That's a generalization, of course. But naturally, if you're thinking about something like something STEM oriented, then sure, there probably is some advantage to asking that science teacher, asking that STEM related teacher to advocate for you. So it depends on the kinds of schools that you're applying to. I think if there's just one little tidbit that I'll just throw out, think macro, think big picture, think about the totality of your application just as much as you're focusing just on the recommendation, because that in and of itself is going to make for a stronger application.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. So a lot of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A are once again kind of around the subject, which teacher and which subject. So knowing that, you know, Smith requires recommendations, Deanna, can you touch a little bit on, yeah, I just see the question coming in over and over again, basically saying, should I diversify my subjects? Or should I stick to the ones that are pertinent to my major?
Yeah. And I've just got to say, the last two comments were so comprehensive and on point. You know, I was even thinking, man, do I have anything to add? And I was thinking, no. But I will say from the Smith perspective that, you know, if you think of, how do we get the best, you know, picture of an applicant? It's nice for us to have, you know, recommendations that aren't necessarily tied to an interest or major, if you will. For Smith too, we are admitting to the college, Smith College. We're not admitting to, you know, College of, right? So we're not admitting in it from a university perspective and admitting to the College of Engineering. So we're not necessarily looking very strongly at what the intended major is, because our expectation is that when you start college, you may have a very strong interest in, you know, a particular subject. But once you get exposed to all that we have to offer, you're very likely to change your mind, right? Your interests change. So in that case, getting a fuller picture of a student by having a variety from 2 or 3 recommendations from, you know, whether it's a STEM related teacher, humanities related, or like an English history related type teacher. I think the best way to approach it is to think of the teachers who, you know you best and can speak to your strengths. But I will also add that it's okay to ask a teacher from a class that you did not get an A in. So sometimes teachers who understand that you've sought them out for you know, consultation. You went to see the teacher after class, and you joined study groups, and you worked really hard to understand the material. And you may not have gotten an A in the class, but you accepted the challenge of that class, you worked hard, you did your best. And that is the kind of real information that can be very important to us, because we know that you're going to do that in our classrooms, that you're going to put in all of that work and try very hard and accept that challenge. You're going to work your hardest. And, I'd argue that that student is the most successful student versus the student that might get the A. So in terms of, who you're thinking about asking of your who to write a recommendation, just think of that relationship. I think Lisa brought up, kind of the relationship between, student and teacher working together, right, to help you put together, an application that depicts, how you want us to get to know you, and your recommendations are going to just one level of that. But so yeah, it does not have to be tied to your academic interest.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deanna. So the next question I'm going to ask Jason. So I know you had already mentioned that students can get a recommendation from a teacher from their junior, their senior year, and that you all as admissions counselors understand that with the pandemic, people might not have that same relationship. But there are some questions about being able to get recommendations from a middle school teacher, or possibly a middle school teacher who later on became a tutor in their high school. So could you give us some advice on that?
Yes, I will echo things that Thomas has said, Deanna has said, Caden, we've quite a fan club of panelists here, but to go back, look at the recommendation or look at the requirements for the application. For Allegheny, we do require a teacher recommendation, and we do want that to be a high school teacher. So what I would say is go beyond the minimum requirement. So in general, we want to get to know you through the application process, through these recommendation letters. We want people that are going to say good things about you, that are going to provide context for the rest of your application. So beyond that, high school recommendation, I would love to read a middle school recommendation as well. In particular, that example of someone that you knew in middle school that has remained in your life, that has served as a tutor. That's certainly a great example of someone that we would want to hear from. But again, I think the important part is always make sure that you're meeting the requirements of the school and the application. So a high school recommendation is definitely ideal and required or recommended. But yes, I think even if maybe you're not able to submit, I think through Coalition you have flexibility in what you can submit, but reach out to us. We're approachable, we're friendly, we want to help. So even if it's being sent not through the Coalition portal, even if you're just emailing it, faxing it, mailing it, I'm showing my age by saying fax, but you can find another way to get it to us, because we want to know you, we want to hear from you.
Thank you, Jason. So Lisa, I know you have a lot of years of experience writing recommendation letters. So some students are asking, how do they approach their teacher or their counselor to ask for a recommendation letter? And also, what if they're a senior this year? Are they too late?
Oh, okay. So my high school, for instance, the teachers want them to wait and talk with them mainly after Labor Day. They didn't want to write letters over the summer, right? There was no rush to kind of get to your teacher, but every school does operate differently. So just like we say, it depends for college admissions, you do want to follow the protocol and the expectations of your high school. I do know you can go online and find lots of recommendation tips that are posted online, and they may not actually serve you well based on how your school expects you to work with faculty. So I would be saying most of the time in the summertime, as you're still researching schools, figuring out what parts of the application are actually required of you, traditionally, most students are asking teachers senior year. If by chance you come from a high school that expected you to ask last spring, please don't think that means you're out of the game, because most of the time, faculty need, out of respect and time, maybe 3 to 4 weeks to write a quality letter. And depending on your school and how many letters a teacher might write, you just want to make sure that you give them the respect of not going up to them and saying, I need a letter in 2 days. That is a huge no-no. Obviously, we know things happen. We're still all pivoting and dealing with a lot of flexibility and grace. But definitely, I would say one thing I wanted to add on a little bit is that concept of what if I was in remote learning for a year and a half and my most recent teachers don't know me well? I would love to hear the admissions people reflect on this too. And I know I'm privileged because I'm at a school with a very small graduating class, but we're encouraging our students to talk with their lead writer. Let's say you are a kid who wants to major in engineering. You realize, however, that your most recent science teacher, it's been during remote learning and you don't feel like the relationship was that strong, but you're stronger with your STEM teachers from 9th and 10th grade. Talk with teachers. Sometimes they share an office space. They can collaborate and almost have a joint STEM letter, but it's authored by one person that you have to invite through the coalition, right? Or through your application portal. So I'm encouraging students to think outside of the box also. You may be working with a college that does not allow a supplemental letter, but you've been working in a lab. Maybe your lab supervisor can send a little narrative to your science teacher. And while they're writing your academic letter, they're throwing in some quotes from that person who saw you in the lab. So I think what students have to realize is don't sweat the small stuff. Just take an inventory of the voices you think who know you best and through what windows of your life. Follow the directions from the college. And then even if you need to talk with your advisor or your high school counselor, or I saw in the Q&A, Derek, someone said, what if you don't have a counselor? Sometimes it's just the school official who uploads your transcript. But you have lots of people in your high school who can help you listen and learn from you on what voices do you want? How do you meet the protocol of the colleges? And to speak on behalf of these amazing admissions professionals, less is more. Nobody has time to sift through 13, 12, 10, 9 letters of recommendation, right? So as a counselor, I like to help everyone siphon down their voices and make sure that they don't do overkill, because too much can be distracting to the admissions people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. That actually leads perfectly into this next question that I'm going to ask Thomas. So one student says that some colleges say something like 1 letter of recommendation required, 3 allowed. What does that even mean? And how many should that student submit?
So the required piece, of course, is what you have to do, right? For this particular example, you're required, you have to submit 1 recommendation at a bare minimum. That you're allowed 3, though, gives you the opportunity to follow some of the advice that you've heard from my co-panelists about these supplemental recommendations, whether it's from the CBO that you're involved with, whether it's from an employer, whether it's from a coach or a mentor. Of course, think about, as Lisa had just mentioned, redundancy, right? You don't want to submit more recommendations than is necessary. If your story can be told by 1 person, 2 people, tops, you might want to kind of just leave it at that. There's kind of this urban legend, I don't know if it's true or not, that at Wake Forest, the record for recommendation letters submitted is 26. As you can imagine, that's a bit much, and it's definitely a no-no. So as you're planning, as you're thinking about how many to submit, follow the instructions. That's the key rule, follow the instructions. But if you're planning for 3, 4 tops, again, that's if the institution will accept it, I think you're probably just about right at the tip of what you want to submit, or the maximum amount that you want to submit. So again, if it's required, be sure to follow those instructions and to submit that letter. If you have the option to do it, then of course it's at your own discretion at that point.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas.
Can I just add something to that? and I'm saying this because I'm the parent of a daughter who will be entering her first year of college in the fall. So I've been through this process just recently, and I kind of feel like I know a little bit about how students think. And that is to the point of, if you are allowed, say 3 in that example, if it doesn't mean that the college really wants the 3, because the way the student will think is, okay, I'm allowed 3. Is it gonna look bad if I don't submit 3? I know that I'm required for 1, but do they really want me to submit 3? No, no. The required is the required. And then, I like Thomas's way of saying that it's an opportunity to add some supplemental recommendations if they're right for you. It doesn't mean that, you have to do the 3. I just wanted to share that because it's kind of part of my experience.
Thank you so much. So this next question, it's actually asked a couple of times. So some students are actually wondering, who should a homeschool student ask for the teacher recommendations as well as the guidance counselor or the high school counselor recommendation? So I'm actually just going to throw that out to anyone, and whoever unmutes first gets to answer. Don't everyone unmute at once.
I'll start. And that's a great question. I mean, they've all been great questions. So just that's a given. I think in the situation of a homeschooled student, it's important to have, this is where the teachers or those who acted as teachers who can best speak from a teacher point of view and can speak to the type of student you are. So for a homeschooled student, that person can be a number of people, perhaps, depending on your situation, right? Because homeschooled students are educated in different ways. So if you have had, if you're the student who have had some classroom work in a brick and mortar school, then, clearly those are teachers who can speak to your how you are as a student. You might belong to a homeschooled association and you together with other homeschooled students take a class. So that person who is teaching that class, even though it's not in a traditional classroom, might be the best person to speak to how you are as a student. Still, those same types of examples apply here. Are you, how have you contributed to conversation? If it's one-on-one, how have you engaged with that person who is, taking the role of your teacher? So that person who can best speak as a teacher is the person or people that you would want to provide a recommendation for you.
I'll jump in as well, and answer was perfect, Deanna. And if I had unmuted first, I would be saying almost word for word. I think to tie into some other questions that we had received about, can I get a recommendation from someone that's a coach or someone that's involved in a club or an internship? I think this is a great way if you have those experiences as a homeschool student. If you play a sport, it's maybe not even a sport that is school affiliated, but just a community, basketball, baseball, soccer, whatever sport team. And, just you want someone that's going to talk about who you are in a group and who you are as part of a team. That's a great option if you're a homeschooled student.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. So another question that has come in a couple of times as well. Can Lisa, do you mind answering this question? And then I'll also open it up to everyone else too. But the students want to know, what is the difference really between a teacher recommendation and a counselor recommendation? So what should they really be asking of these individuals to write about them?
Great question. I often use a simple analogy for students to understand. A counselor letter is like the floodlight. An academic teacher rec is like the flashlight that really, even though they may know you from extracurriculars, right? Their job is not to talk about you on the tennis team if they're writing your STEM letter, right? They can throw that in to give anecdotal examples, but they really have to be that flashlight. Because as admissions people on the panel today have said, they're always reading to determine your future potential. And first and foremost, they're admitting you as a student in the classroom, right? So when you think about the counselor letter can often talk about things that the teachers may not even know. We may talk about how a concussion has impacted a series of grades, or how your family has gone through some special circumstances, or how you transferred from 2 schools, and we want to put that perspective in to bring that all together. Or maybe you had to take a medical leave, and we're the people that have to give that broader scope of you, which is so much about the context. I always tell students, I will never know you as well as the teacher who has you 3, 4, 5 days a week, right? For a class for 36 weeks of a school year. However, and I was reading in the Q&A, Derek, where some people said, again, what if I don't have a counselor, I don't know them well? We often do a lot of pulling in students and making sure that we connect with parents and guardians to know if we're going to advocate for you, we also want to be on the same page with you. Let me give you an example. If you're going to disclose a learning difference, or you're going to disclose that you've had financial hardship, those are things that I hope that you can build a trust with your counselor or your school official, so that we can also bring that voice to the table and make sure that we validate those challenges, we validate joys, we validate so much of your life from the global perspective. Because if you are doing something that brings you an accolade, or brings you a distinction, or you're known in the school for X, Y, and Z, or you've had obstacles or challenges, you think about that counselor as someone who can listen and learn and validate. And sometimes we're the ones who even have to talk with a teacher to make sure that they understand, by keeping confidentiality, that maybe challenges that we've seen may have bled into the classroom that they're not aware of. So use us as this conduit to be able to bring so much together as a floodlight for you.
Awesome, thank you. So this actually kind of goes along with that. So as a student is asking a counselor or a teacher to write a recommendation, if the counselor or teacher asks them, how long should it be? Do you all have any guidance on what the student should tell a counselor or teacher if they say that? Or as a student just wrote, an English teacher said, definitely get it from me, because writing is applicable everywhere. English teachers write the best recommendations. So just ways that students can talk to teachers and counselors about the recommendation letter.
If you're sending 26 letters, it should be really short. I think, we don't see the reflection of the letter isn't necessarily a reflection of you as a student. I work at Allegheny College. I've read recommendation letters where a teacher or a counselor references another school that is not Allegheny. We don't see that as a reflection upon you, the student. We don't even necessarily see that as a reflection of the teacher or the counselor. I have sent emails to students with the wrong name just as a mistake, because you're juggling a lot of things. I would say, even though most of this is online, a traditional letter length is what we're expecting. Something with a few key examples of who you are as a student is what we're looking for. But again, yes, it's a letter about you, but if it's too short or too long, we're not seeing that as a reflection of who you are as a student.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. So there are 2 questions that I do want to get to, because I know that we are running close on time. So the first question is, if a student perhaps lives out of the US and the teacher does not read or write English, what should the student do in terms of getting a recommendation to your institutions? You know what? I was going to say, I'm going to throw it over to Deanna, just because you're right in my line of vision. So
Okay, and then I had taken myself off mute, so we were communicating somehow without words. I was putting, Smith in this situation, and I mean, it is true that many of the recommendations and other aspects of an application come to us translated. And so if there is a way that the student can provide that translation, that would be helpful. But I think that is a question that is good to ask institutions where you are interested in applying. And I say that because, you know, Smith might have the resources to go somewhere and have a letter translated. It could be a faculty member who does it for us. It could be, you know, a translation service that does it for us. Not every institution might be able to do that. So I think if you're in that situation, that is a good reason to contact the admission office of the schools where you're interested in to ask how they would prefer that that be handled. Because you also want to be able to have the teacher that you have selected to write on your behalf. So I wouldn't let that be a reason to not ask the teacher. I would ask how to make that happen on the college side, rather than choose someone that you prefer not to ask, you know, in comparison to that optimal teacher.
It looks like Caden has his hand raised.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I had to like dig in my memories to remember why this question is applicable to me. So I've not experienced this very much with undergraduate admissions, but absolutely with graduate admissions. It's pretty common for folks outside the US to want to come to the US for graduate programs and to potentially be working with folks who are providing them letters that English is not their first language or they don't speak English. So I would absolutely double down on what Deanna just said, reach out to the offices. There was an office that I worked for and we had a translation service. It wasn't fantastic, but it provided enough of a translation for us to understand the key high-level points that those employers or supervisors or professors were needing to communicate about those students. So it is unfortunately going to end up being kind of like a case-to-case basis. Different colleges and universities are likely going to have different processes for you to follow, but absolutely, as Deanna had said, please do not use that as a reason for you to move away from a teacher that you really believe is going to most strongly represent you as a student. That college or university that you're excited about is going to want to work with you to get that information.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Caden. So the last question that I'm going to ask, and I think this has been answered in a few different ways, but if we could just reiterate this. So a student who has not met any of their teachers in person for 11th and 12th grade because of the pandemic, but they did have teachers in 9th and 10th grade who they knew very, very well. So they're really struggling with, do I get a recommendation from the most recent teachers who are in my more advanced classes, or the teachers who will definitely know me well because they've met me in person in 9th and 10th grade? I'm going to let Deanna answer that because she unmuted. So
I did, and this, my answer comes in part because of my experience. I think if you're in that situation, and we were prepared for this during this last cycle, is if you have one recommendation from kind of the way that the school would like to receive it. So whether that could be a junior or senior year, and then maybe another from someone from earlier years. But what I really want to say is don't discount that remote learning. Is teachers have gotten to know you, and some students have shown up in different ways remotely than they would have in person. So I think it's easy to think of remote learning as so much of what we did not get or what you did not get. But there are some ways that teachers are able, and I'm even referring to our experience reading applications this past cycle. We have gotten to know students through recommendations when teachers really only knew them remotely. They're going to use that context, and there are ways that they can highlight how you have been resilient and worked through this challenge of remote learning that can work to your benefit. So don't discount the remote learning in that way. Just reframe how you're thinking of it.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for sharing all this wonderful information, advice, and insight. And thank you to all the students who submitted these wonderful questions. This was an incredible workshop. And then just want to go ahead and point out something that was dropped into the chat. So we actually have Path to College scholarships. So at the Coalition, we believe in starting early and stressing less. So that's what this workshop series is all about. And that's also the motivation behind our Path to College Scholarship. So 5 members of the class of 2022 will win $1,000 for getting a jump start on their applications by July 30th. And you'll find all the details at our website in the chat right there. And then also, yes, join us. So register for the upcoming sessions, July 14th, next Wednesday. We have reporting your coursework and grades. And then the following Wednesday, we have all about testing. So thank you once again. And I hope everyone has a great day. And thank you for giving us those 2 extra minutes of your day.